I still remember the sharp, heavy clatter of my silver fork dropping against the porcelain dinner plate. It was a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the dining room. That night was supposed to be just another ordinary Sunday dinner, a routine meal in the house I had poured my blood, sweat, and savings into, saving from the brink of foreclosure. The air smelled of roasted chicken and stale tension. My father, Orson, sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid and his eyes cold, devoid of any paternal warmth. He leaned forward, crossing his arms over his chest, and delivered the sentence that shattered my reality. "Give up your room, Maeve. Or get out now." His voice was flat, carrying no hesitation, no remorse. I sat there frozen, the breath knocked out of my lungs. My sister, Sloane, sat to his right, swirling her wine glass. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, her eyes dancing with malicious triumph. "Don't let the door hit you," she added cheerfully, her voice practically singing the insult. Beside her, her husband Declan offered a smug, self-satisfied smirk, adjusting the cuff of his expensive, flashy suit as if my eviction was merely a minor annoyance being swept away. Rage, pure and blinding, flared in my chest. It was a visceral heat that burned through my veins. I was the one who had spent the last 4 years carrying this family on my back. I was the one paying the electric bills, fixing the crumbling foundation, and putting the food on this very table. Every dollar I earned as a structural engineer seemed to vanish into the bottomless pit of my parents' financial incompetence. And now, they were treating me like a stray dog they no longer had the patience to feed, simply because their golden child needed a place to crash. Before we dig into this mess, drop a comment with your city and local time. I want to see how far my story of family betrayal has traveled. My mother, Althea, stared down at her untouched peas, refusing to meet my gaze. Her silence was the final twist of the knife. In that single, agonizing moment, the illusion of family shattered into irreparable pieces. I was not a daughter to them. I was a living, breathing ATM. My value was measured strictly by the balances of my bank accounts and the convenience of my silence. The blatant disrespect, the sheer audacity of demanding I surrender my only sanctuary in the home I funded, was a level of cruelty I had never fully prepared myself to face. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm of grief and profound anger. They expected me to lower my head, to accept the basement or the streets, to continue funding their delusions. They expected a victim. I stood up, feeling a strange, icy calm wash over the inferno inside me. I thought walking out that door was the end of my nightmare. But I had no idea that Declan was already planning to steal everything my parents owned. The sheer audacity of that dinner table ultimatum didn't just happen overnight. It was the culmination of years of quiet disrespect, a slow poison that I had allowed myself to drink because I believed in the fundamental lie of unconditional family love. To understand the depth of their betrayal, you have to understand the staggering weight of what I had given them. I was 32 years old, but I felt like I had lived 3 lifetimes of stress. I had moved back to Omaha not out of convenience, but out of a desperate, panicked sense of duty. The house was practically falling apart, a physical manifestation of my parents' inability to manage their lives. I worked grueling hours at my engineering firm, calculating load paths, analyzing stress tests, and ensuring massive commercial structures wouldn't collapse under pressure. Ironically, the structure I was struggling the most to keep intact was my own family. I spent my days in a hard hat and steel-toed boots on dusty construction sites, arguing with contractors and double-checking structural steel connections. I would come home utterly exhausted, my muscles aching and my mind numb with numbers, only to face a second shift of managing my parents' chaotic finances. The resentment had been building block by block, a sturdy wall of unspoken grievances. Orson never saw my exhaustion as a sacrifice. He saw it as my basic obligation. I was the steady, boring daughter, the dependable one who lacked the shimmering, chaotic charisma of Sloane. Sloane, who changed her career aspirations every season, flitting from failed makeup influencer to disastrous travel vlogger, leaving a trail of credit card debt in her wake. They celebrated her every chaotic pivot, while my steady progression in a demanding technical field was met with disinterested nods. When Orson delivered his ultimatum, the ghosts of every check I had ever written for them flashed before my eyes. Every canceled vacation, every skipped dinner with friends, every modest purchase I denied myself so I could cover their endless emergencies. The room felt incredibly small, the walls pressing in on me. The smell of the roast chicken suddenly made my stomach turn. I looked at their faces one by one. Orson, stern and unyielding. Althea, weak and evasive. Sloane, glowing with unearned victory. Declan, an arrogant parasite feeding off the chaos. They were a united front against me. They had rewritten the narrative of our lives, casting me as the selfish villain standing in the way of Sloane's grand destiny. The injustice of it was so thick it was hard to breathe. The anger I felt was not the hot, explosive kind that leads to screaming and throwing things. It was a cold, dense fury. It settled in the pit of my stomach, heavy and unmovable like a concrete block. I realized then that reasoning with them was a useless endeavor. You cannot use logic to defeat a delusion. You cannot use math to explain sacrifice to people who only value the aesthetic of success. They wanted my room for the golden child and her flashy husband. They wanted to erase my presence while keeping my wallet open. It was a brutal awakening, the kind that rips the naive optimism right out of your soul. The air in the dining room felt stagnant, toxic. I knew if I stayed a second longer, I would suffocate under the weight of their entitlement. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, waiting for my compliance. But my compliance had expired. To truly grasp the magnitude of the insult, you need a tour of my personal museum of pain. Let us rewind the tape to 4 years ago. I was living in a bright, airy apartment in Denver, finally making a name for myself at a prestigious engineering firm. I was independent, happy, and miles away from the constant, draining drama of my family. Then came the frantic, tearful phone call from Althea. Orson had mismanaged his pension, made a series of disastrous investments, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on my childhood home in Omaha. The guilt trip was immediate and overwhelming. They painted a picture of 2 elderly, frail parents being thrown onto the cold streets. Against my better judgment, against the warnings of my friends, I packed up my life, requested a transfer to my firm's Omaha branch, and moved back into my old bedroom. From the moment my boxes hit the floor, I became the unofficial head of the household, a role that came with all the financial burden and none of the authority. Let us talk about the numbers, because engineers deal in facts, not feelings. I took over the mortgage immediately. Every single month, I transferred $1,800 from my hard-earned salary directly to the bank just to keep a roof over their heads. I paid the utility bills, the property taxes, and the grocery runs. But it did not stop at basic survival. The house was a dilapidated money pit. The defining moment of my indentured servitude happened 2 years into my return. A massive spring storm tore through Omaha, and the ancient, rotting roof finally gave way. Water poured into the living room, ruining the drywall and soaking the hardwood floors. Orson paced around, wringing his hands, looking at me expectantly. I drained my emergency savings fund to hire a reliable contracting crew. It cost $15,000 in cold, hard cash to strip the old shingles, repair the water damage, and install a new, weatherproof roof. I remember standing in the yard, watching the workers hammer away, feeling a strange mix of pride and profound anxiety about my depleted bank account. Orson walked out onto the porch, squinting up at the sun. I expected a word of gratitude, perhaps a quiet thank you for saving the house from mold and structural rot. Instead, he frowned, crossed his arms, and sighed heavily. "Those workers are making an awful racket," he complained, his tone laced with irritation. I could not even take my afternoon nap. "Tell them to keep it down." I stared at him, utterly stunned. $15,000 of my money was sitting on top of his house, keeping him dry, and his only concern was his disrupted nap schedule. That was the reality of my existence. My monumental sacrifices were treated as minor inconveniences if they did not perfectly align with his comfort. And then there was Sloane. While I was calculating structural loads and paying for roof repairs, Sloane was living in a delusional bubble of impending fame. She was convinced she was meant for greatness, though she never quite figured out what that greatness entailed. Her crowning achievement in financial abuse occurred when she got engaged to Declan. She came over for dinner one evening, flashing a ring that looked suspiciously like cubic zirconia, though she swore it was a custom-cut diamond. She sat at the very table where I would later be evicted, pulling out a thick binder filled with magazine clippings and Pinterest printouts. She announced she was planning a destination wedding in a rustic vineyard, complete with imported orchids, a champagne tower, and a custom designer gown. Then she dropped the bomb. She looked at Orson and Althea, her eyes wide and pleading, and said she needed $20,000 to cover the venue deposit and the floral arrangements. Orson rubbed his jaw, looking uncomfortable but compliant. Althea looked at me. "Maeve," your mother said, her voice dripping with that manipulative sweetness she used when she wanted something unreasonable. "You have such a good job. You have great credit. Why don't you take out a small personal loan to help your sister? It is her special day." I felt the blood drain from my face. I was already working overtime to rebuild my savings after the roof disaster. I looked at Sloane, who was nodding enthusiastically, as if asking me to go into $20,000 of debt for a single party was the most natural request in the world. I refused. I laid out the math. I explained my expenses, the mortgage I was already paying for them, the lack of a safety net. I told them a firm, unequivocal no. The reaction was swift and brutal. Sloane burst into theatrical tears, wailing that I was ruining her life, that I had always been jealous of her happiness. Orson slammed his fist on the table. "You are cold-blooded, Maeve," he shouted, his face turning red. "Your sister needs you, and you sit there counting your pennies like a miser. Family helps family." I stood my ground, refusing to sign my financial life away for her vanity project. They eventually scraped together a fraction of the money from a high-interest credit card they hid from me, and the wedding was downsized to a tacky local banquet hall. But the damage was done. In their eyes, I was the villain. I was the selfish, heartless older sister who refused to support the golden child's dreams. My $15,000 roof was forgotten. My monthly mortgage payments were expected. But my refusal to fund a luxury party was an unforgivable sin. I stood my ground and refused to pay for Sloane's fake luxury life. That was my first strike. But then, she brought Declan home. Declan was a walking, talking red flag wrapped in a tailored suit that smelled heavily of expensive, overpowering cologne. The first time Sloane brought him to the house for a formal introduction, he pulled into the driveway in a pristine, midnight blue Porsche. I watched from the living room window, my engineer's brain immediately kicking into analytical mode. The car had dealer plates. It was rented. But Orson and Althea were mesmerized. They practically tripped over themselves running out to the porch to greet him. He stepped out of the car, flashing a blinding, practiced smile. He wore a chunky Rolex on his wrist, making sure to gesture widely whenever he spoke so the sunlight would catch the metal. I noticed right away that the second hand ticked sharply instead of sweeping smoothly, like a genuine automatic movement. It was a fake, just like the car, just like the man himself. But my parents were blind to the details. They only saw the shiny surface. Dinner that night was an exercise in extreme patience. Declan dominated the conversation, tossing out empty buzzwords that sounded impressive to anyone who didn't know better. He claimed to be a hotshot private equity investor specializing in commercial real estate. He talked rapidly about synergy, crypto leverage, and disruptive market paradigms. Orson nodded along sagely, clearly not understanding a single word, but deeply impressed by the confident delivery. Althea stared at Declan with undisguised adoration, treating him like royalty. I sat quietly, cutting my steak, analyzing the inconsistencies in his grand tales. The turning point came when he decided to turn his attention to me. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his red wine, and cast a patronizing look across the table. "So, Maeve, Sloane tells me you're an engineer. Doing the math, checking the concrete, that sort of thing?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Structural engineer, yes. I ensure buildings do not collapse. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. It is solid, honest work. But you know, wage slaves never get rich, sister-in-law. You trade your time for a fixed paycheck. You will spend your whole life working for someone else's vision. You have to take massive risks if you want massive rewards. You need to leverage assets, build a portfolio. Orson chimed in eagerly. Declan is right, Maeve. You should listen to him. He knows how the real world works. You are too cautious. I felt a muscle twitch in my jaw. I was cautious because my caution was the only thing keeping them out of bankruptcy court. But I held my tongue, curious to see how deep his lies went. Oh? I asked mildly. What kind of massive risks are you taking right now, Declan? Tell us about your latest acquisition. He leaned forward, sensing an audience eager to be dazzled. Actually, I am closing a massive deal next week. A massive commercial property downtown. Prime location. We are going to gut it, retrofit it for luxury mixed-use lofts, and flip it for triple the investment. It is the old brick warehouse on the corner of Elm and Maple. Beautiful bones, just needs a visionary to unlock the equity. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I knew that building. I knew it very intimately because my firm had been contracted by the city to inspect it 2 months prior. The building on Elm and Maple did not have beautiful bones. It had a severely compromised foundation, massive termite damage in the primary load-bearing beams, and a toxic mold issue that required specialized hazmat abatement. The city had condemned it, locked it down in a tangled web of zoning violations and structural red tape that would take years and millions to clear before a single hammer could swing. It was an uninsurable nightmare, impossible to purchase or leverage without a massive, heavily regulated municipal intervention. And here was Declan, confidently claiming he was closing a private equity deal on it next week. He was lying. It was not a small exaggeration, it was a brazen, fabricated lie designed to sound impressive to people who didn't know the territory. I looked at his smug face, his fake watch ticking away, and then I looked at Orson, who was staring at Declan with a mixture of awe and greed. I could have exposed him right there. I could have pulled up the city inspection records on my phone and destroyed his little charade. But as I looked at my parents, seeing how desperately they wanted to believe in this golden goose, I knew it would backfire. If I exposed him, I would not be the hero protecting them from a fraud. I would be the jealous, bitter sister trying to ruin Sloane's happiness again. They would defend him, just as they had defended Sloane's demand for wedding money. I took a slow sip of my water, masking the cold realization settling over me. That sounds like a very ambitious project, Declan, I said evenly. I wish you the best of luck with the city inspectors. He waved his hand dismissively. Bureaucracy is just a minor speed bump for people with capital, Maeve. You just have to know the right people. If you've ever had to bite your tongue while a con artist charmed your family, hit that like button. You're going to want to hear what happened next. The rest of the evening was a blur of his boasting and their fawning. When he finally drove away in his rented Porsche, the house felt stained by his presence. I retreated to my room, the sanctuary I had fought so hard to keep, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. My mind raced, connecting the dots of his flashy behavior, his empty jargon, and his blatant lies. I knew he was a fraud. I knew he was dangerous. I knew he was lying. I just didn't know he was targeting the very roof over our heads. The illusion of peace shattered violently just 3 months after their scaled-down wedding. It was a rainy Tuesday evening. I had just finished reviewing a massive stack of blueprints and was sitting in the living room, trying to unwind with a cup of tea. Orson was asleep in his worn-out Lazy Boy recliner, the television blaring a golf tournament. Althea was in the kitchen, humming nervously as she chopped vegetables. The tension in the house had been thick all week. Orson had been taking hushed, secretive phone calls, abruptly changing the subject whenever I walked into the room. Then came the sound of heavy tires grinding against the gravel driveway, followed by the slamming of car doors. I stood up, walking to the window. A black rideshare SUV was idling out front. Sloane and Declan were standing in the rain, dragging 6 massive, designer suitcases onto the porch. They looked disheveled, their usual polished veneer cracked. Declan was arguing aggressively with the driver about the fare, while Sloane frantically pushed her wet hair out of her face, hauling a heavy Louis Vuitton trunk up the steps. Dread pulled in my stomach, cold and heavy. I opened the front door just as they reached the landing. "What is going on?" I asked, staring at the mountain of luggage. Sloane pushed past me without a word, dragging the trunk across the hardwood floor I had paid to resurface. "We are moving in," she announced breathlessly, dropping the bags in the center of the foyer. "It is just temporary." Orson jolted awake at the noise. He shuffled into the hallway, his face instantly brightening at the sight of them, completely ignoring the fact that they looked like refugees fleeing a disaster. Declan stepped inside, shaking the rain off his expensive trench coat. "Our luxury condo had a massive plumbing failure," he lied smoothly, his eyes avoiding mine. "Black mold everywhere. The management company is gutting the place. We need a place to crash while they renovate our mansion." It was a pathetic excuse. Luxury condos do not evict tenants into the rain without massive insurance payouts and hotel accommodations. They were broke. They had been evicted. I could read the desperation in the tight lines around Declan's mouth and the panic darting of Sloane's eyes. But my parents bought the ridiculous story without a single question. "Oh, you poor things." Althea gasped, rushing over to hug Sloane. "Of course, you can stay here. This is your home. We have plenty of room." The problem was, we did not have plenty of room. It was a modest 3-bedroom house. My parents occupied the master suite. The second bedroom was my sanctuary, filled with my drafting tables, my computer, and the furniture I had bought. The third bedroom was a tiny, damp space in the basement, currently serving as a storage unit for Orson's junk and a breeding ground for spiders. We moved into the dining room for dinner. The atmosphere was incredibly strained. Sloane was picking at her food, complaining about the lack of water pressure in the guest bathroom. Declan was scrolling furiously on his phone, ignoring everyone. I sat quietly, waiting for the inevitable shoe to drop. It dropped halfway through the meal. Orson cleared his throat, setting his fork down with a deliberate clatter. He looked at me, his expression hardening into that familiar mask of stubborn authority. "Maeve," he began, his tone brokering no argument. "Declan and Sloane need a proper space to work and recover from this condo disaster. The basement is not suitable for them." I stopped chewing. I looked from Orson to Sloane, who was suddenly looking very interested in her salad, a tiny, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "What are you saying, Dad?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "Give up your room, Maeve," Orson commanded. "Or get out now." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. It was the ultimate betrayal, delivered between bites of roasted potatoes. I looked at Althea. "Mom?" I said, waiting for her to intervene, to be the voice of reason. Althea refused to look at me. She focused intently on her plate. "Don't be petty, Maeve," she murmured weakly. "They are doing big things. Declan needs a home office for his investments. You can set up a nice little space down in the basement. It won't be forever." I felt a surge of adrenaline so intense my hands started to shake. I placed them flat on the table to steady myself. "I pay the mortgage on this house," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I paid $15,000 for the roof over your head. I bought the refrigerator you are storing this food in. And you are telling me to go sleep in a moldy basement so your unemployed daughter and her fraud of a husband can take my bed?" Declan finally looked up from his phone, sneering. "Don't be dramatic, Maeve. We are family. We make sacrifices. Besides, my firm is about to close a massive tech merger. I will buy you a new house when the funds clear." "Don't let the door hit you," Sloane added cheerfully, unable to contain her glee. She loved this. She loved watching me being discarded. I looked at Orson. His face was a brick wall of defiance. "I made my decision," he stated coldly. "You can either be a supportive sister and move your things downstairs tonight, or you can pack your bags and leave my house." His house. The house I saved. The house I funded. In that moment, the final thread of familial obligation snapped. I felt a strange, profound clarity. I did not yell. I did not cry. The anger was so deep it bypassed outward emotion entirely. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I looked down at the 4 of them, a family of parasites protecting their own. They expected me to cry, to beg, to negotiate, to ultimately submit and move into the damp, moldy basement. Instead, I gave them exactly what they asked for. And I took my things with me. The silence following my departure from the dining room was palpable. I did not storm up the stairs. I walked with deliberate, measured steps. The clarity I felt was intoxicating. For years, I had allowed guilt and a warped sense of duty to bind me to a sinking ship. Now, Orson himself had handed me the life raft and told me to jump. I was more than happy to oblige. I entered my bedroom and pulled my large travel duffel from the closet. I packed meticulously, my engineering mindset taking over. Clothes, toiletries, vital documents, my laptop. But I was not just packing my personal belongings. I was taking back my investments. The mandate was clear, I had to leave. But there was no clause stating I had to leave behind the comforts I had paid for. I started with the electronics. I walked into the living room, ignoring the hushed, nervous whispers coming from the dining table. I walked straight up to the massive, 65-inch smart television mounted on the wall. I had bought it for Orson's birthday the previous year, a premium model that cost me over a week's salary. I unhooked the cables, lifted the heavy screen off the mount, and carefully laid it face down on a blanket. "What are you doing?" Orson's voice sparked from the doorway. He stood there, his face red with a mixture of confusion and rising anger. I did not look at him. "I am leaving, just as you ordered," I said calmly, wrapping the power cord. "And I am taking what belongs to me." I carried the television out to the trunk of my car. I made several trips. I took the high-end microwave I had purchased when the old one caught fire. I took the ergonomic office chair from the corner. But my most satisfying retrieval was the water filtration system. The municipal water in our neighborhood tasted strongly of chlorine and rust. A year ago, I had hired a plumber and paid $3,000 to install a state-of-the-art, whole-house reverse osmosis water filtration system in the kitchen. It was my money, my name on the invoice. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a wrench from the utility drawer, and crawled under the sink. The sound of metal clinking against metal echoed in the quiet house. Sloane marched into the kitchen, Declan trailing closely behind her. "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing under there?" Sloane demanded, crossing her arms. I turned the main valve, shutting off the water supply to the kitchen, and began unhooking the complex network of tubes and filters. "Taking my property," I replied, grunting as I wrenched a stubborn bolt loose. "You cannot do that." Sloane shrieked, panic pitching her voice high. "I need clean water for my skin routine." "You're being incredibly petty, Maeve." I slid out from under the sink, holding the heavy, dripping filtration unit in my arms. I looked her dead in the eye. "You wanted the house, Sloane. You got the house. But you did not get my bank account. Enjoy the rust." Declan stepped forward, trying to maintain his facade of wealthy indifference, though his jaw was tight. "Let her take her little toys, Sloane," he sneered, puffing out his chest. "I will call a contractor tomorrow and buy you a system 10 times better. We don't need her junk." I smiled, a genuine, chilling smile. "I look forward to seeing that, Declan. Make sure you use a real credit card, not the one you maxed out to rent that Porsche." His face flushed a deep, ugly purple, but he said nothing. He stepped back, allowing me to pass. I hauled the dripping system out the front door and dumped it into the back seat of my car. I did a final sweep of my room, ensuring nothing of value was left behind. The room looked bare, stripped of my personality, reduced back to 4 empty walls. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was just a space. I walked out the front door without saying goodbye. I did not look back at Orson, who was standing on the porch, his arms crossed, watching me leave with a dark scowl. I did not look at Althea, who was weeping quietly into a dish towel. I started the engine, the familiar hum of my car comforting in the night. As I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror, the house looked smaller, sadder. The heavy burden of responsibility that had weighed down my shoulders for 4 long years suddenly vanished. I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated freedom wash over me. The air in the car felt cleaner, lighter. I rolled down the window and let the cool night breeze hit my face. I drove straight to the apartment of my closest friend and coworker, Rowena. I had texted her a brief summary of the explosion, and she had immediately told me to come over. When she opened her door, seeing me standing there with bags under my eyes and a car full of appliances, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me into a tight hug and helped me lug the massive television up the stairs to her spare room. We sat on her couch late into the night, drinking cheap wine and eating takeout. I detailed the confrontation, the sheer audacity of Declan's lies, and the painful reality of my parents' betrayal. Rowena, sharp and pragmatic, listened quietly before shaking her head. "You are better off, Maeve," she said firmly. "They're a sinking ship, and they were trying to chain you to the mast. Let Declan play captain. He will run them aground faster than you think." I slept that night on Rowena's futon. It was uncomfortable. The streetlights outside were too bright, and the room smelled faintly of her cat, but it was the best sleep I had experienced in years. I woke up the next morning feeling energized, ready to reclaim my life, my finances, and my peace of mind. I started looking for a small, quiet studio apartment downtown, far away from the suburbs and the toxic gravity of my family. I found a place quickly, signed a lease, and began the process of moving in. For 4 glorious days, my life was my own. I went to work, focused on my structural designs, and came home to a space where no one demanded my money or insulted my career. The silence of my new apartment was a soothing balm. But the peace only lasted 4 days. Because Sloane wasn't done making my life hell. The attack did not come directly from Sloane. She was far too cowardly for a direct confrontation. Instead, she unleashed the flying monkeys. It started on a Thursday morning while I was in the middle of a complex load-bearing calculation at my office desk. My phone buzzed on the desk. Then it buzzed again. And again. Within a minute, it was vibrating continuously, a relentless mechanical angry hum. I sighed, picking it up, expecting a panicked work email about a delayed concrete shipment. Instead, I saw a tidal wave of notifications from Facebook. Tags, direct messages, angry emojis. My heart sank as I opened the app. Aunt Beatrix, Althea's younger sister and the undisputed champion of family gossip, had posted a massive, rambling essay on her public timeline. Beatrix was a bitter woman who spent her days monitoring everyone else's lives, judging their choices while ignoring her own messy reality. She had tagged me, Orson, Althea, Sloane, and a dozen other extended relatives. The post was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation and outright lies. It read, "I am absolutely heartbroken to see what this younger generation has become. To watch a daughter abandon her elderly, vulnerable parents in their time of need is a tragedy. Maeve has decided that her fancy career and selfish lifestyle are more important than the family that raised her. She packed her bags and fled in the middle of the night, leaving poor Orson and Althea to fend for themselves while dealing with severe home repairs. Thank God for Sloane and her wonderful husband Declan, who have moved in to take care of them. Shame on you, Maeve. Money changes people, but blood should be forever." Attached to the post was a deeply unflattering, candid photo of me from a Thanksgiving dinner years ago, looking annoyed. Below the post, the comment section was a war zone. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade were calling me an entitled brat. Family friends were leaving praying hands emojis and expressing their deep disappointment in my character. Sloane had loved the post, adding a comment of her own, "It has been so hard on Mom and Dad. Declan and I are doing everything we can to fix the mess she left behind. Please pray for our family." The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it made my blood boil. They were framing my eviction, and eviction Orson had aggressively demanded, as a cruel abandonment. They were painting the parasite Declan as the savior. The direct messages were worse. They were filled with vitriol, accusing me of elder abuse, of hoarding wealth, of being a cold, calculating monster. The phone vibrated again in my hand. Incoming call. It was Orson. I hesitated, then swiped to answer, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. "Hello." "Maeve," his voice boomed through the speaker, harsh and demanding. "Have you seen what Beatrix posted? The whole family is talking about your little stunt. You are embarrassing us." "My stunt?" I hissed, keeping my voice low so my coworkers wouldn't hear. "You literally ordered me to get out of the house. You told me to leave. Don't twist my words." He yelled back. You threw a tantrum because you couldn't share the house with your sister. You abandoned your responsibilities. Now, listen to me carefully. Just because you ran away doesn't mean your obligations end. You are still going to send us $2,000 a month for the mortgage and maintenance. It is your filial piety. You owe us that much for raising you. The audacity was so immense it was almost comical. He had kicked me out to make room for a con artist, allowed my aunt to drag my name through the mud on a public forum, and was now demanding a massive monthly allowance like a tyrant collecting taxes. I am not sending you a dime, Orson, I said, my voice eerily calm. You chose Declan. Let him pay your mortgage with his massive equity deals. Do not call me again. I hung up and immediately blocked his number. Then I blocked Althea. I blocked Sloane, Declan, Aunt Beatrix, and every single cousin who had left a nasty comment. I went into my phone settings and locked everything down, creating an impenetrable digital fortress. I walked into the break room, hands shaking slightly with leftover adrenaline. Rowena was making coffee. She took one look at my pale face and set the pot down. What happened? She asked sharply. I showed her the post. She read through the comments, her eyes narrowing in disgust. These people are a cult, Maeve. They are building a narrative to justify draining you dry. They want to make you the villain so they don't have to look in the mirror. She handed me a mug of black coffee. You need to protect yourself, she said, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. Declan is a grifter. You know that. And grifters don't just stop at free rent. They dig into assets. When was the last time you checked your credit report? Have you checked public property records? If your name is tied to anything they touch, he will ruin you. I froze. My name was not on the mortgage. Orson had insisted on keeping the deed in his name to preserve his pride, even though I was making the payments. But my name was associated with their address. My mail had gone there for 4 years. They had my social security number from old tax documents stored in the filing cabinet in the basement. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Rowena was right. The social media attack was a distraction, a smokescreen to keep me defensive while Declan operated in the shadows. I rushed back to my desk, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I logged into a major credit bureau portal, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I answered the security questions, my breath catching in my throat as the page loaded. I logged into my bank portal. My credit score was perfect. But my parents' public property records? That was a horror story waiting to unfold. Thank you for watching part 2 of the story. If you're satisfied that I've decided to move out and take all my belongings, please leave a comment. I'm win. This is a special symbol for viewers who have followed me this far. I will like and reply to all comments containing the keyword I'm win. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see what disaster Declan will cause next. I logged into my bank portal. My credit score was perfect. But my parents' public property records? That was a horror story waiting to unfold. Rowena's warning echoed in my mind, a persistent, chilling alarm that I could no longer ignore. Grifters do not just stop at free rent. They dig into assets. I sat at my small kitchen table in my new studio apartment, the glow of my laptop screen casting long, harsh shadows across the room. Outside, the city of Omaha was quiet, but inside my chest, a storm of anxiety was brewing. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the county clerk's public property records portal. The website was clunky, an outdated relic of early internet design, but it held the legal truths that my family was desperately trying to ignore. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A part of me wanted to close the laptop, to pour a glass of wine, and to pretend that my family's financial ruin was no longer my problem. They had kicked me out. They had chosen Sloane and Declan. Why should I care? But my engineering brain, the part of me trained to find structural weaknesses and prevent catastrophic failures, would not let it go. I needed to know the extent of the damage. I needed to know if the blast radius of Declan's fraud was going to reach my doorstep. I typed in Orson's legal name and the address of the house. The search icon spun for what felt like an eternity. When the results finally populated the screen, my breath caught in my throat. There, listed under the primary deed of trust, was a newly filed document. It was dated just 3 weeks prior, right around the time Declan and Sloane had abruptly moved in. It was a second mortgage. My eyes scanned the scanned PDF document, zeroing in on the numbers. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. The loan amount was staggering. $320,000. $320,000. It was an astronomical sum, far more than the remaining equity on the original mortgage that I had been paying down for 4 years. My mind raced, trying to comprehend how Orson, a retired man with a mismanaged pension and a history of bad credit, could possibly secure a loan of that magnitude. I scrolled down to the guarantor and lien holder section. The lender was not a traditional bank or a recognized credit union. It was an obscure, out-of-state private lending firm. And listed as the primary guarantor, the entity securing the loan against the property was a limited liability company, a firm named Apex Synergy Holdings. I did not need a team of corporate lawyers to tell me who owned Apex Synergy Holdings. The pretentious, meaningless name had Declan written all over it. He had convinced Orson to leverage the entire equity of the house to secure a massive cash loan, using his fake private equity firm as the middleman. But the horror did not stop there. I kept digging, clicking through the attached appraisal documents that justified such a massive loan amount. Lenders do not just hand over $320,000 without proof that the property is worth the risk. I opened the property valuation report. As I read through the appraiser's notes, a wave of profound nausea washed over me. The report cited recent, extensive structural upgrades to the foundation and the roof, drastically inflating the market value of the aging house. Attached to the back of the appraisal, serving as documented proof of these high-value upgrades, were copies of architectural and structural engineering blueprints. They were my blueprints. I recognized the title block. I recognized the specific load-bearing calculations I had done on my own time, on my own drafting table, to ensure the new roof I paid $15,000 for was structurally sound. Declan had rummaged through my files in the house, stolen my professional work, and submitted it to the shady lender to falsely inflate the value of Orson's property. He had weaponized my own labor, my own expertise, to facilitate the theft of my parents' home. The anger that hit me was not the hot, explosive rage from the night of the dinner. This was a cold, calculating fury. It was the sharp, precise anger of a professional who has had their work stolen and manipulated by a parasite. Declan was not just a liar, he was a thief, and he was using my parents as his willing accomplices. I spent the next 3 hours saving every single document. I downloaded the deed of trust, the fraudulent appraisal, the loan origination forms, and the guarantor agreements. I backed them up to a secure cloud server and printed physical copies, organizing them into a thick, undeniable file of evidence. I had the smoking gun. I had the exact paper trail detailing how Declan was draining the lifeblood out of my family's estate. But I knew my parents. I knew the terrifying depth of their delusion. If I just drove over to the house and handed Orson this file, he would not thank me. He would accuse me of hacking, of forging documents, of trying to sabotage his golden son-in-law out of spite. Althea would cry and tell me to stop being so negative. Sloane would scream that I was trying to ruin her marriage. They were too deeply invested in the lie to accept the truth from the daughter they had discarded. I could not go to them. I needed to confront the devil himself. I needed to look Declan in the eye, show him that his fragile house of cards was visible to me, and give him a choice. He could walk away, or I would burn his charade to the ground. I picked up my phone, my hands remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I found his number in my contacts, a number I had only used once to send him an address for a family gathering. I typed out a short, precise text message. Meet me at the downtown coffee roasters on 10th Street tomorrow at noon. Come alone. I know about Apex Synergy Holdings. I know about the $320,000. I hit send, tossed the phone onto the couch, and stared at the thick file of evidence on my table. I had the smoking gun. But I knew if I just handed it to my parents, they'd defend him. I needed to confront the devil himself. The downtown coffee roasters on 10th Street was a bustling, noisy establishment, filled with the loud hiss of espresso machines and the chaotic chatter of the lunchtime rush. I arrived 15 minutes early, securing a small table in the far corner, away from the windows. I ordered a black Americano and sat with my back straight, the thick manila folder resting ominously on the wooden table in front of me. At exactly noon, the bell above the door chimed. Declan walked in, and even in a crowd, his arrogance was a beacon. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit that looked entirely out of place in the casual coffee shop, his fake Rolex catching the overhead lights. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no panic in his expression, no fearful hesitation of a man who had been caught. Instead, he wore a smirk, a look of mild amusement as he strolled over and slid into the chair opposite me. He did not order a drink. He just leaned back, steepling his fingers, and looked at the manila folder. "So, the disgruntled engineer wants to play detective," he said, his voice smooth, dripping with condescension. "You sounded very dramatic in your text, Maeve. Apex Synergy Holdings. Very scary stuff." I did not smile. I did not engage in his banter. I simply opened the folder and slid the printed copy of the second mortgage agreement across the table, tapping my index finger on the loan amount. $320,000, Declan, I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the cafe. Borrowed against a house that already has an existing mortgage. Secured by a shell company registered to a virtual mailbox in Delaware. And justified by stolen engineering blueprints bearing my professional seal. Declan glanced at the paper, then back at me. He did not even flinch. He let out a soft, patronizing laugh. "Stolen is a very harsh word, Maeve. I prefer to call it leveraging available family resources to maximize equity potential. Your father was thrilled to provide the documentation. It really expedited the underwriting process." "He knew about it?" I asked, feeling a sharp twist of disgust in my gut. "Orson gave you my blueprints?" Declan shrugged, adjusting his cuffs. "Orson signed a full, comprehensive power of attorney over his financial affairs to me 3 weeks ago. He trusts my vision. He knows that to generate real wealth, you have to liquidate stagnant assets. That house was just sitting there, doing nothing. I am putting that equity to work in high-yield commercial markets." "It is a scam," I stated bluntly. "You are running a Ponzi scheme, Declan. There is no commercial loft project on Elm and Maple. The city condemned that site. You took $320,000 of my parents' equity to pay off your previous debts or to fund the ridiculous lifestyle you and Sloan are pretending to live." Declan leaned forward, dropping the casual facade. His eyes turned cold, flat, and menacing. The air between us seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Let us get something straight, sister-in-law," he whispered harshly. "You are a glorified human calculator. You work for a paycheck. You do not understand high-level finance, and you certainly do not understand the psychology of your own family." He tapped the document with a manicured finger. "Do you honestly think they will believe you? Do you think Orson, a man whose ego is so fragile he kicked his own daughter to the curb just to feel like the king of his castle, will admit he got played? Do you think Althea will ever admit her perfect daughter married a fraud?" He smiled, a terrifying, predatory grin. "I offered them a dream, Maeve. I promised them a 20% return on their investment. I promised them early, luxurious retirement. You offered them the reality of living on a tight budget and paying off a boring mortgage. People will always choose the beautiful lie over the ugly truth. They signed the papers. They gave me the power. You are entirely powerless here." My heart hammered in my chest, but I refused to let him see me sweat. I pulled my phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. "Let us test that theory," I said. I dialed Orson's number. It rang 3 times before he answered. His voice was instantly hostile. "I told you not to call us unless you were ready to apologize and send the maintenance money, Maeve," Orson barked. I put the phone on speaker, sliding it toward the center of the table so Declan could hear every word. "Dad, I am sitting here with Declan." I pulled the public property records. He took out a $320,000 second mortgage on the house. He is using a fake LLC. The city project he told you about is condemned. He is stealing your equity. There was a heavy silence on the line. Declan sat back, crossing his arms, his smirk returning. He looked supremely confident. When Orson finally spoke, His voice was trembling, but not with fear. It was trembling with rage aimed entirely at me. "You are a deeply sick, jealous person, Maeve," Orson spat, the venom in his words echoing from the small speaker. "Declan told me you might try something like this. He warned me that your jealousy over Sloane's success would make you vindictive. Dad, look at the county records yourself." I pleaded, my professional calm cracking for a fraction of a second. "He is running a scam. He took your money. He is investing my money," Orson roared. "He is securing our future. Something you never cared to do, you selfish brat. You are dead to me. Do not ever call this number again." The line went dead with a sharp click. Declan picked up his phone, checked a notification, and stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at me, looking like a king observing a defeated peasant. "I told you, Maeve. They made their choice. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a flight to catch for a very important networking event. Enjoy your coffee." He turned and walked out of the cafe, blending seamlessly into the busy downtown crowd. I sat alone at the table, the dial tone still humming faintly from my phone. I looked at the undeniable proof of his crime, the papers that meant absolutely nothing to the people who needed to see them the most. The frustration was suffocating, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolution. I had done my part. I had tried to warn them. They had looked at the truth and chosen the lie. I packed the folder back into my bag. They made their choice. I wiped my hands clean. I decided to sit back and watch the timer hit 0. And 0 came faster than anyone expected. The following week was a masterclass in psychological detachment. I threw myself into my work at the engineering firm, volunteering for extra structural surveys and spending my evenings drafting complex load path analyses. I refused to look at social media. I ignored the persistent, lingering guilt that society conditions us to feel when we walk away from our blood relatives. I treated the situation like a condemned building. I had flagged the critical structural failures, I had issued the mandatory evacuation notices, and now I was simply standing safely behind the caution tape, waiting for gravity to do its inevitable job. Gravity hit at exactly 2:14 in the morning on a Wednesday. I was jolted awake by the shrill, frantic ringing of my cell phone. The screen illuminated the dark room, flashing a number I had blocked, but they were calling from Althea's phone. I stared at it, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. The timer had hit 0. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear. Before I could even say hello, a sound of pure, unadulterated hysteria shattered the silence. "Maeve. Maeve, please, you have to come. Help me, oh my God, Maeve." It was Sloane. She was not just crying, she was hyperventilating, her words tumbling over each other in a chaotic, breathless panic. "Slow down," I said, my voice thick with sleep, but laced with the cold reality I had been anticipating. "What is happening?" "He is gone," she shrieked, the sound piercing my eardrum. "Declan is gone. His clothes are gone, his passport is gone, his watch box is gone. And there are people here, Maeve. There are men in suits going through the house. They are taking Dad's computer. Please, I am terrified, you have to help us." I sat up, turning on the bedside lamp. The satisfaction I thought I would feel was entirely absent, replaced by a grim, heavy exhaustion. The parasite had fed, and now the host was dying. "I am on my way," I said, and hung up. I dressed quickly in jeans and a heavy sweater, the chilly Omaha night air biting through the fabric as I rushed to my car. The drive to the suburbs felt surreal, the empty streets flashing by like a movie montage. As I turned onto the familiar street of my childhood home, the flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding houses in a chaotic, strobing glare. There were no local police cruisers. The vehicles parked haphazardly on the lawn and in the driveway were dark, unmarked federal SUVs. I parked down the street and jogged toward the house. The front door was wide open. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow agency acronyms printed on the back were moving methodically through the living room, carrying out cardboard boxes filled with files and electronics. I stepped onto the porch, the same porch where I had hauled my water filtration system just weeks prior. A tall man in a sharp suit and a badge clipped to his belt stepped into the doorway, blocking my path. Hold it right there, ma'am. This is an active crime scene, he said, his voice authoritative and firm. I am Maeve, I said, holding up my hands. I am Orson and Althea's daughter. I do not live here. I came because my sister called me. The agent's eyes narrowed slightly, evaluating me. He tapped his earpiece, murmured something, and nodded. I am Investigator Beckett, Financial Crimes Division, he said. Come inside, but stay in the foyer. Do not touch anything. The scene inside the house was a portrait of total devastation. It looked as though a hurricane had ripped through the carefully curated illusion of their lives. Orson was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, his face ashen, staring blankly at the floor. Althea was huddled in the corner of the dining room, rocking back and forth, sobbing uncontrollably. And then there was Sloane. She was pacing the hallway in a set of wildly expensive, emerald green silk pajamas, her hair a tangled mess, clutching a stack of credit cards in her trembling hands. Investigator Beckett motioned for me to step into the kitchen, away from the chaos. Your family has been the victim of a massive, sophisticated wire fraud and embezzlement scheme, he stated, his tone professional and detached. I know, I said quietly. It was Declan. Apex Synergy Holdings. Beckett raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my immediate knowledge. You are aware of the LLC? I nodded. I pulled the property records last week. I saw the $320,000 second mortgage. I tried to warn my father, but he refused to listen. He gave Declan power of attorney. Beckett sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It is worse than just the mortgage, Maeve. Your brother-in-law was running a classic, high-yield Ponzi scheme. He was using funds from new investors to pay fake dividends to older investors. The scheme collapsed 3 days ago when a major institutional backer demanded an audit. Beckett pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket. He used the power of attorney to secure the $320,000 against this property. But he also liquidated your parents' entire retirement portfolio. He drained their savings accounts, their emergency funds, and cashed out your father's pension. $185,000 in liquid cash, gone. He wired the total sum to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover his tracks and fled the country. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. $185,000 of life savings, plus $320,000 in debt. $500,000, stolen in the blink of an eye. He left them with nothing, I whispered, the sheer scale of the financial slaughter finally settling in. Less than nothing, Beckett corrected grimly. They owe the lender the $320,000, and the original mortgage is still active. The bank will initiate foreclosure proceedings by the end of the month. I am sorry, Maeve. They're entirely bankrupt. I looked out into the hallway. My family was broken, stripped of their pride, their wealth, and their golden illusion. Are you guys seeing red yet? Because what my sister said next almost made me lose my mind. Keep watching. Sloane wasn't crying because her husband was a criminal. She was crying because her credit cards were suddenly declining. And then, she turned her wrath on me. The reality of the situation hung in the air of the house like a thick, choking smoke. The federal agents continued their grim work, tagging Orson's desktop computer and cataloging the fake designer bags Declan had bought for Sloane as potential evidence of purchased assets with stolen funds. I walked out of the kitchen and stood in the foyer, looking at the ruins of my family. The power dynamic, which had been so rigidly enforced for years, had violently inverted in the span of a few hours. Orson slowly pushed himself up from the staircase. He looked 20 years older. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had confidently ordered me out of his house was gone. He stumbled toward the front door, his breathing shallow and erratic. He had to grip the doorframe, leaning heavily against the wood, and then stumbled out onto the porch, grabbing the hood of a parked federal SUV just to keep himself from collapsing onto the concrete. His face was a ghastly shade of chalk white. Althea finally stopped rocking and looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen, searching the room until they landed on me. She reached out a trembling hand, her voice a frail, pathetic whisper. Maeve. Maeve, please. What do? We have no money for groceries. The accounts are empty. Before I could even process the sheer tragedy of her question, Sloane launched herself at me. She crossed the hallway in 3 frantic strides, her expensive emerald silk pajamas swishing around her legs. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, ugly entitlement. She grabbed the lapels of my cheap, utilitarian winter coat, her manicured nails digging into the fabric. "You knew," Sloane screamed, her voice echoing off the walls, drawing the attention of Investigator Beckett and the other agents. "You told Dad you knew about the LLC. Why didn't you stop him, Maeve? Why didn't you do something?" I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her accusation freezing the blood in my veins. She was standing in the wreckage of a $500,000 fraud, wearing clothes bought with stolen money, and she was blaming the person she had gleefully evicted. "You have to fix this," she demanded, shaking my coat violently. "You have that engineering job. You have savings. You need to pay off that second mortgage right now before the bank takes the house. You have to give Dad the money." The chaotic noise of the house seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of Sloane's frantic breathing and the ticking of a wall clock. I did not yell back. I did not match her hysteria. I reached up, my hands moving with slow, deliberate precision. I gripped her wrists, my fingers locking around the delicate bones, and forcefully peeled her hands off my coat. I pushed her back, creating a solid boundary of physical space between us. "Look at yourself, Sloane," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, slicing through her panic like a scalpel. She blinked, stunned by my physical resistance. "What?" I gestured to her outfit. "You are wearing silk pajamas that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. You are holding platinum credit cards that Declan paid off using Mom and Dad's retirement money. I warned you." I sat at a coffee shop and looked at the documents, and I called Dad to warn him that your husband was a thief. I turned to look at Orson, who was still leaning against the SUV outside, gasping for air. I raised my voice just enough so it would carry through the open door. "And what did Dad say?" I asked the room. "He told me I was a deeply sick, jealous person. He told me I was vindictive. He told me I was dead to him, and he ordered me never to call again." I looked back at Sloane, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The illusion she had built her entire identity around was gone. She was no longer the wealthy wife of a private equity investor. She was the broke, unemployed accomplice to a federal fugitive. "You wanted the house, Sloane," I continued, my words hitting her like physical blows. "You wanted my room. You laughed and told me not to let the door hit me on the way out. So I left. I did exactly what I was ordered to do. I stayed out of your business. But we are family," Sloane wailed, the tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "You cannot just let us lose the house. You have the money." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had finally exorcised the ghost of familial obligation. "No, Sloane," I said coldly. "I had the money. The money I spent keeping this roof from caving in. The money I spent paying the original mortgage. I gave you everything I had, and you handed it all to a con artist because he wore a shiny watch and told you pretty lies." I stepped backward, moving toward the front door. "I will not give you another dime. Not for the mortgage, not for groceries, not for your credit card bills. You made your choice. You chose the lie. Now you get to live in it." I walked out the front door, stepping past Orson. He did not look at me. He just stared at the wet pavement, a broken man who had traded his loyal daughter for a flashy illusion. I got into my car, the engine roaring to life, drowning out the sounds of Althea's weeping from inside the house. I drove away from the flashing lights of the federal vehicles, leaving the wreckage behind. I felt no guilt. I felt no sorrow. I felt only an immense, profound emptiness, followed quickly by the clean, sharp oxygen of total liberation. The reality of their bankruptcy was settling in. But the bank wasn't the only one coming for them. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled, revealing the bleak, unforgiving landscape of the consequences. The Omaha winter had thawed into a crisp spring, but there was no rebirth for my family. The bank had moved with ruthless efficiency. With a massive second mortgage in default and the original mortgage unpaid since the day I moved out, the foreclosure process was swift and brutal. My childhood home, the house I had bled my savings dry to protect, was seized, auctioned off to a corporate property management firm, and painted a sterile, lifeless gray. The fallout from Declan's Ponzi scheme had rippled violently through our extended family network. Aunt Beatrix, the champion of Facebook morality who had so viciously attacked me for abandoning my parents, had secretly given Declan $50,000 of her own savings, convinced she was getting in on the ground floor of his fake commercial real estate empire. When the feds raided the house and the news broke, Beatrix lost her mind. Her public timeline, once a shrine to my family's supposed virtue and my alleged cruelty, turned into a digital war zone. She posted daily, unhinged rants, cursing Orson and Althea for introducing a criminal into the family. She demanded they repay her the $50,000. She tagged Sloane in photos of Declan's wanted posters issued by federal authorities. The flying monkeys who had once attacked me were now tearing each other apart, fighting over the scraps of a stolen fortune. It was a dark, poetic justice that I watched from a safe distance, sipping coffee in my peaceful apartment. The reality of their new lives was a stark, miserable contrast to the luxury they had briefly pretended to enjoy. With their credit destroyed, their savings vanished, and a massive debt hanging over their heads, Orson and Althea were forced to rent a cramped, poorly insulated two-bedroom apartment in a rough, industrial neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Orson, a man whose fierce pride had once dictated every rule of the household, was forced out of retirement. At 65 years old, his body aching and his spirit broken, he took a job as a night shift janitor at a local high school. He spent his nights mopping the floors of gymnasium locker rooms and emptying trash cans, a brutal, exhausting penance for his blind arrogance. Althea took a part-time job answering phones at a budget motel, her days of knitting and fussing over china plates entirely over. And Sloane, the golden child, the aspiring influencer who refused to drink anything but reverse osmosis filtered water. With Declan vanished into the wind and the federal government monitoring all of her accounts, she had no choice but to enter the workforce she had so deeply despised. A mutual friend told me she had seen Sloane working as a cashier at a discount grocery store. She described Sloane standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, scanning barcodes for minimum wage, looking utterly defeated. Her manicured nails were chipped, her expensive silk pajamas long gone, sold to a consignment shop just to pay the electric bill. The grand destiny she felt she was owed had evaporated, leaving her trapped in the mundane reality she used to mock me for. I had maintained strict, impenetrable boundaries. I had not spoken to any of them since the night of the raid. I ignored the letters that arrived in my mailbox, returning them to the sender unopened. I blocked the new phone numbers they tried to call from. But one evening, while I was cooking dinner in my quiet kitchen, my phone rang. It was a number from the high school where Orson worked. I stared at it, the simmering pot of pasta sauce forgotten. A morbid curiosity, a desire to hear the final surrender, made me answer. "Hello," I said, my voice neutral. "Maeve." It was Orson. His voice was unrecognizable. It was thin, hoarse, and stripped of all its former booming authority. He sounded old. He sounded terrified. I did not respond. I waited. "Maeve, please do not hang up," he pleaded, his breathing ragged. "We are drowning. The rent on this apartment just went up. My back is giving out from the mopping." Sloane got fired from the grocery store because she screamed at a manager. "We cannot afford groceries this week." He paused, waiting for the empathetic daughter he used to exploit to step in and offer a lifeline. When I remained silent, he pushed further. "I know you have that nice apartment downtown. I know you got a promotion. Please, Maeve. Can Mom and I come stay with you? Just for a few months until we get back on our feet. We will sleep on the couch. We just need a safe place." The sheer, monumental irony of his request was staggering. The man who had sat at the head of a table I paid for and ordered me to give up my room for a con artist was now begging to sleep on my couch. I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the glittering skyline of the city I had conquered on my own. Dad, I said, my voice eerily calm, carrying the weight of 4 years of suppressed anger and final, undeniable victory. Yes? He asked, a desperate flicker of hope in his voice. I only have a one-bedroom apartment, I stated coldly. Do you remember what you told me at that dinner? You told me I should be a supportive sister and go sleep down in the basement. I took a slow, deep breath. It is a real shame, Orson. Because my luxury apartment building does not have a basement. I did not wait for his response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting the line. I blocked the high school's number. I finally severed the chain. I was no longer the collateral damage in their twisted family dynamic. The click of the phone ending that call with Orson was the final, defining punctuation mark on the darkest chapter of my life. I set the device down on the counter and felt a profound, physical lightness wash over my entire body. The phantom weight I had carried on my shoulders, the crushing burden of their expectations, their debts, their endless entitlement, was truly, permanently gone. I was no longer the invisible pillar holding up a rotting structure. I was free. The contrast between their collapse and my ascension was stark, measured in the exact kind of numbers my engineering mind loved. While they were drowning in $500,000 of debt and working minimum wage jobs to survive, my career had skyrocketed. Untethered from the constant stress and financial drain of my family, I had poured my energy into my profession. Just 2 weeks after that final phone call, my firm's senior partners called me into the glass-walled boardroom. They had reviewed my structural plans, the very same plans Declan had stolen to facilitate his fraud, and they were blown away by the precision and efficiency of my designs. They did not just give me a pat on the back. They handed me a promotion to Senior Project Manager, a title that came with a massive corner office and a staggering 45% raise in my base salary. I had taken that raise and upgraded my life. I moved out of the small studio and signed a lease on a gorgeous, high-rise apartment overlooking the river. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, a chef's kitchen, and a massive balcony. It was a space funded entirely by my own talent and hard work, a sanctuary that no one could ever demand I surrender. On a warm Friday evening, I stood on that balcony, the city lights reflecting in the dark water below. Rowena was sitting in a plush patio chair next to me, pouring us generous glasses of an expensive, full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon. To the senior project manager, Rowena said, raising her glass with a wide, genuine smile. May your structures never fail and your boundaries remain reinforced concrete. I laughed, the sound clear and joyous, and clinked my glass against hers. To reinforced concrete. As I sipped the wine, the cool evening breeze rushing past, I allowed myself a moment of deep reflection. The journey from that suffocating dining room table to this balcony had been brutal. It had required me to dismantle everything I thought I knew about loyalty and love. Society programs us from birth to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are taught that family is an unbreakable bond, an unconditional safety net that we must sacrifice ourselves to maintain, no matter how toxic the environment becomes. But the truth, the harsh, undeniable truth that I learned the hard way, is that blood means nothing if it is used as a weapon of manipulation. A family is supposed to be a team. It is supposed to be a foundation built on mutual respect, gratitude, and support. Orson, Althea, and Sloane were not my family. They were parasites. They viewed my success not as something to celebrate, but as a communal resource to be mined and exploited. They demanded my money, my time, and my living space, but they offered nothing in return except judgment and the constant, looming threat of exile if I stopped complying. When they chose Declan, when they chose the shiny, fake watch, and the empty promises of a con artist over the daughter who was literally keeping a roof over their heads, they did not just make a financial mistake. They revealed their core values. They valued the illusion of wealth over the reality of sacrifice. Setting a boundary, a real, unyielding boundary, is the most terrifying thing a person can do. When I walked out of that house with my television and my water filter, I felt like a villain. When Aunt Beatrix unleashed the internet mob on me, I felt like a monster. But boundaries are not designed to punish others. They are designed to protect you. If I had stayed, if I had caved to Orson's demands and moved into that moldy basement, Declan would have stolen my savings too. I would be bankrupt right alongside them, scanning groceries with Sloan to pay off a fraudulent mortgage. Walking away was an act of extreme self-preservation. It was the moment I stopped being the scapegoat and started being the author of my own life. I learned to value my peace of mind over their comfort. I learned that I am allowed to enjoy the fruits of my labor without feeling guilty that my abusers are suffering the consequences of their own actions. My chosen family now consisted of people like Rowena, people who supported me, who celebrated my promotions, and who never once asked me to fund their delusions. The blood tie was severed, but the wound had healed clean, leaving behind a scar that simply reminded me of how strong I had become. But even with all this peace, the echo of the past occasionally surfaces. The story of my family's ruin became a cautionary tale in our extended circle. While most people realize the truth after the federal indictment and Aunt Beatrix's public meltdown, there are still whispers. I still occasionally receive a stray Facebook message from a distant cousin or an old family friend, calling me a devil. They say that no matter what Orson and Althea did, they are still my parents. They argue that letting elderly people work janitorial jobs while I sit in a luxury apartment is a sin. They tell me I should have bailed them out one last time, just to keep them off the streets. It is a narrative that tries to pull me back into the guilt trap, a final, desperate attempt to make me responsible for a disaster I tried to prevent. I delete the messages, but the societal pressure surrounding family loyalty is a heavy, pervasive thing. So, I have to ask you guys, was I too harsh? Should I have bailed them out one last time? Thank you for watching until the very end. If you felt my frustration and cheered for my freedom, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. See you in the next story.